Dick, the next question comes to you, and that is, as editor, what are your expectations of peer reviewers? So what do you find the most helpful to enable you to make a decision in a reviewer report?
So I think it was partly covered by Roberto in his answer. You know, you want to have enough information for the editor to decide whether the article is, in my case, is whether it is new, what is new about it. If there are issues with the article, then what they are. You know, I don't want reviews that say this paper is no good. I'd like to know the reason, you know, the reasons. So enough information. I'd like the review to come promptly. You know, I don't want the review to be late or several days late. And I'd like reviewers to respond promptly to requests. If they cannot do the review, then they should just simply refuse, rather than waiting and waiting and waiting for the reviewers to respond. I would like them to answer quickly, you know, yes or no. And if they accept to do the reviews, I'd like them to actually deliver. You know, there are many cases of reviewers who accept to do a review, and then they don't complete the reviews. So you know, if they accept, then please do the reviews. These are, as I mentioned at another event, these are the ideal things that an editor would like to have. As a reviewer, sometimes I don't behave as I would like reviewers to do. So I have to put my hands up and say, you know, I'm not an ideal reviewer in many cases, but as an editor, I would like reviewers to do what I just mentioned.
And if a reviewer hasn't come back to you with a review in time, do you tend to give extensions, or at what point do you say, okay, I need to move on to a new reviewer?
Yeah, I always move to new reviewers. And when I have enough reviews, then I inform the reviewers that their reviews are no longer required. So I cannot wait for them, you know.
Yeah. It's good to know. Thank you. And Roberto, do you have anything to follow up with on that question? So you talked about a bit about what your expectations of peer reviewers are, but any other things that you'd like to comment on what you find most helpful to enable you to make a decision about a paper?
Well, the key criteria ideally for a good review are, again, that it doesn't, so for formal papers, of course, you want to have an idea whether whatever formal arguments are made are actually correct. For empirical papers, you want to make sure that whatever estimation strategy is used is indeed correct. And you also want to make sure that the results are replicable. So it really depends on the paper. So an ideal reviewer of a theoretical paper with maths, you know, some sort of formal derivation of results should take the trouble to at least quickly skim through the formal results and be able to comment whether they seem reasonable or they are actually correct. The ideal reviewer of an empirical paper should actually kind of look into the results very closely, and ideally, but it hardly ever happens, actually replicate them, provided the author has provided code and the database. But at a broader level, what you want to know is whether the paper is original. So there is a substantive contribution, whether the paper is rigorous in whatever disciplinary sense is relevant. You want to make sure that the paper contributes to some certain debates, and you want to know which debates they are, whether they are current debates or somebody's beating a dead dog, essentially, or dead horse, depending on which animal you prefer. So, I mean, so these are the kind of information that are crucial, because you want to know that the paper is good quality, it is original, so where quality is defined on a disciplinary basis, it's and therefore rigorous in its argument and cogent, then you want to make sure that it contributes to some important debates, and that the argument is original. So rigorous, original, and on relevant debates. So relevance, originality, and rigor are the key things. So a review that is able to cover these grounds in 2-3 pages is better than a 12-page review in which they go and say, well, at page 12, line 7, the construction of this particular sentence is not so clear. Because these are the kind of things that can be addressed at the later stage. You could always go back to the author, ask for proofreading, you can tell them to rewrite the whole thing, etc. A generic comment simply saying, overall, the quality of the writing is not very clear. See a couple of examples is much better than a huge list. So that's what I would do. Besides, there is a fundamental trade-off. When reviewers start to go into the nitty-gritty details of a paper, it is much more likely that the refereeing job will fall through the cracks. So the referee forgets about it, postpones, procrastinates, and this looks like, oh my God, I have to write a whole paper of my own in order to do this review properly, etc. No, that's not necessary. You look at a paper, if you're an expert in the field, certain things should be pretty obvious to you. So especially in the case of a rejection, somebody who's experienced can literally skim through a paper and understand whether the paper is should be rejected very, very quickly and provide an informative review. And if it is a good paper which needs a bit of help, then you devote a bit more time to it.
Okay, thanks. Excellent. All right. So, Philippe, I have you next for a question on ethics. So we're seeing a rise in ethics cases in recent years, from duplicate submissions to originality issues to authorship disputes, etc. So how do you and your editorial team work to identify and address potential ethical issues with the manuscripts under review?
It's a rising problem. I mean, so this is an issue that we see currently. I mean, we get a lot of authors trying to submit at the same time the same document to different journals and so on, hoping to be published as fast as possible. I can understand the pressure they are receiving in one hand, because I mean they need to publish in order to get recognition, but it's not a reason for doing, I would say, stupid submission in two parallel things and so on. We try to investigate with the editorial team as much as possible to try to identify duplicate documents that could be submitted. We have several specific tools. Some of those tools that are used in university for plagiarism detection and so on are very useful. So editors like Taylor and Francis are providing some tools, but we have also internally within the institution some specific tool for that, and we are in a systematic way looking at the submission we are receiving. And I think in most of the cases we are able to detect the already published things. Of course, when the things are submitted in parallel, this is something which is quite different. We have a declaration which has to be signed by the people who are submitting, and I think we remind them what to do and what not to do. But I hope it will be more carefully understood by the people who are willing to submit the things within the future. But it's true that during the recent years, the number of cases is rising. And I think this is the case for most of the disciplines. This is not only for us.
Absolutely.
But this is something that has to be underlined. And for the young people who are listening to us today, I think they have to be patient and to accept to follow the rules and to submit one by one the different papers and to be successful. And I think it will be a benefit at the end for their reputation, for their careers, and so on. They should understand that the peer reviewing is potentially the people they are working with, or they could work with within the future. And obviously, it's a bad mark in some extent to come back to someone else you had as a reviewer and saying, oh, that was the problem with this paper. I'm not so sure that I would like to hire you and you to invite you to join my team. I think this is something that they think twice before to take this type of decision.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that last one about this is your community, so you need to be careful. And if you're not aware of the rules, you need to understand what they are, because I think duplicate submission surprises a lot of early career researchers as a rule, but it's their job to understand, how the system works. Debra, I'd like to follow up with you. Do you have anything to add to that? What are you seeing with your journal?
Well, relatively little to add to what Philippe has said. We haven't had we've had no authorship disputes, but I think the duplicate submissions one is a hard one to tackle, if it's concurrent. What sometimes has happened there is that our reviewers have picked up on that. The paper's gone up for review, and because the reviewer is very close to that field, they recognise it's rarely been literally a duplicate submission. It's often a submission that substantially draws on the same work, the same findings, at a level that is too close for comfort. So again, the reviewers come up are very important there. But I think also as an editorial team, we keep trying to be up to date with what might be happening in terms of some of these ethical issues, because they do keep changing, and some of it's to do with the various technologies that are available, both tools for us but also the different ways that authors work. But other than that, I think our view would be much the same as the things that Philippe has described.
Right. So you're mainly seeing duplicate submissions then in your journal as an issue more than any.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I say to me, in some ways, it isn't so much duplicate. They're not submitting the same article to two places, so sometimes it's still ethically inappropriate. But I think sometimes it's to do with being a novice or not being experienced enough to realise that you can't send what is substantially the same to two different journals when all you've done is alter the title and various bits in it. It comes back to, I think it was Duke who said that one of the key things that you're looking for when writing an article is what is the original contribution to knowledge. Well, you can't make an original contribution to knowledge if you've already had something published, which is very, very similar. And I think that's probably more what we see. It's that duplication of material or duplication of ideas rather than literally exactly the same article being presented twice.
Yeah, we tend to call it salami slicing, trying to squeeze out as much as you can out of something. Yeah. I'm going to stick with you for the next question, and that is, how is the COVID-19 pandemic, or how has the COVID-19 pandemic changed research and publishing? What have you seen both in your professional life outside of the journal and editing the journal?
Well, I think from an editing point of view, and I suspect this is the same for the other authors, we've seen a massive upsurge in articles that are addressing COVID, that has got COVID in the title. However, a lot of it is not high quality. It's been slightly opportunist, and I think a sense that because it's got COVID-19 in the title, it's going to attract greater interest. So very typically, it's been under-theorized work. It's been work that's relied often on survey methods that haven't been terribly rigorous. And it's not really clear what the contribution it makes to the field has been. So I think there's been a lot of surveying of how has life changed in universities with all the online teaching we do. And that's obviously because we're an education journal, and it's just not saying anything of any great significance. So that's one thing. But I think more broadly for education as a field, I think COVID-19 is not necessarily going to change research, but I think what it's changing is the much, much stronger foregrounding of social justice issues in education and mental health issues in education. I think that there will be it's just beginning to emerge actually, some very serious and rigorous research, which is picking up on the way the pandemic has, certainly here in the UK, really highlighted social disadvantage, economic poverty, and how that plays out in education and educational opportunity, and the way in which mental health issues, it's not that they weren't there before, but somehow the pandemic has just shone a spotlight on those things.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm wondering, in terms of how the journal has been operating, I've heard from some editors that the peer review process has been a little bit challenging in the last 18 or so months, just because, people don't have as much time, and most journals are seeing an increase. So is that, yeah, I see Roberto.
Yeah,
nodding
that's
as
it.
well.
I mean, it's hard to know for certain if that's COVID or if it's the fact that actually, and again, I don't know how true this is of all journals, but it's true of a lot of education journals, is that the number of submissions that we're getting to the journal have been rising and rising and rising quite substantially over the past 3 to 4 years. And actually, there has been quite a big rise within the pandemic, which may well be pandemic related in that people have been perhaps able to write at home. But the matching the number of submissions we get to the need for reviewers has been becoming a challenge anyway. And I think, and that's partly to do with the countries that are submitting research to the journals that we to our journal has increased. That we're getting. It's not that it's particularly that Far East and Asia. We're getting a lot more submissions from there. That's just increasing that need for more and more reviewers. But yes, I mean we've had reviewers. In fact, we've even had editorial board members directly affected by COVID and unable to fulfill duties. So yeah, I think it's had an immediate effect as well as that broader effect.
Yeah, thanks. Duke, I wonder if you have anything to follow up with on that question. What have you noticed this past 18 plus months?
It has been very similar to what Debra has been saying. We've had an increase in the number of papers with COVID in the title. The quality is not as bad as in the case of education papers, because, if they say something COVID, then it is something designed for COVID, so it is truly COVID related. We've had also problems with reviewers being unable to complete reviews because of COVID. They've been affected directly by COVID, or their families have been. So those problems have arisen. I've seen more papers which do not require experimental work. So simulation papers and so on, papers that can be done without requiring access to equipment. So those numbers have increased. Yeah,
that's interesting. I didn't think about that aspect of it, but of course it's going to change the kind of outputs, communication and research.
Yeah.
Great. Right, so moving on, let's see. Philippe, I have another question for you, and that is, although prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future, let's give it a try. What do you think research communication, the role of the journal, and the role of peer review will look like in 10 years' time? Do you think peer review or even journals will still be relevant in 2030?
Yeah, it's a nice question. I mean, so we can spend the full day discussing on that and about our future as editor and the future of journal. I think in one hand we have a trend about the fact that we may have access to, in our case, scientific documentation. This is true, so this is coming up. But even if this documentation is becoming more and more freely available on internet, we need to have a kind of screening process in order to be sure about the quality of the documents we are accessing. Right now, I think the job of the journal is to say, okay, this is scientific sound, it's meaningful, and you can trust it. I mean, so we are, in our case, in the process of engineering, and at the end, we have a problem to solve and a solution to implement in order to serve population, to serve the society. And we want to be sure that the assumptions we are taking are relevant, meaningful, and at the end, we deliver the right product, the right service for the society. And the job of the journal will remain, maybe in the actual shape of the journal, but maybe in another form. What we are doing, it's a kind of validation. It's a quality process, validation of what has been found, what has been defined as a solution, and what can be implemented. So, of course, edition, publishing job, and so on may evolve. It will evolve in the coming years. But I think at the very end, we still need this validation in order to be sure on what we will have to implement. Having a jet flying, having a skyscraper being built, remain on physics, and those things have to be properly written in order to be sure that the concrete and the structure of the plane can resist to the travel. I don't want to take and to risk my life on something which is just, I would say, an attempt by someone who had free time to write something. This is, I'm a little bit joking, but I mean, this is the type of validation that we need.
Absolutely. That's great. Roberto, do you have anything to add to that? Visions of the future, what it could look like?
Visions of the future and what it would look like, I'm not going to answer. If you want to know what I think about the refereeing process and where it's going, I might have something not completely stupid to say. And that is that I completely agree with Philippe. I can see the publishing industry changing radically in many possible directions. Open access is one obvious thing. I mean, it's all sorts of institutions, especially the European Union, are pushing hard in that direction. But in terms of the refereeing, the role of referees in the process, if anything, it's going to become more important rather than less. And the reason is pretty simple, is the increase in specialization. So not only will we still want to check that whatever one writes about a jet, it's actually valid, or a building, we'll probably have referees evaluating the publication of somebody who tries to unpack a tiny aspect of a jet or a tiny aspect of the construction of a building, which even an editor in the field of aerodynamics or mechanical engineering will not be able to evaluate. So expert opinions will be more important than ever. So one strategy that journals have adopted to cope with that is to increase the editorial board. So some disciplines have huge editorial boards, and associate editors act essentially as referees. The truth is, there's no end to that process. And it's, you know, if you have a paper on a tiny subfield, a tiny topic in its subfield of a subfield, the likelihood of having the right associate editor on board is zero. So you will have to ask an expert opinion outside, even 100 years from now.
Yeah, you mentioned open data as well in your journal too, and I do think that from the publisher side of things, looking at how things are changing, the fundamentals aren't changing, but it's just opening up the process more and more. So if you look at F1000 Research, our platform, where the whole peer review process is open for everyone to witness, you know, there's checks in place to make sure that those preprints meet a certain standard or criteria, but the open access process is visible to everyone, and every kind of version of the paper is posted online. I can see that movement happening definitely across the board, but definitely validation needs to occur. Great. Let's see, Duke, I've come to you next with a question, and that is, what is your advice to early career researchers just starting out in publishing?
A new peer reviewer who just starts in the area. Or is it a new researcher that you want
New
to be?
researcher. New researcher. So early career, PhDs.
Yes, yes. So I would say that if they want to become a peer reviewer, that's not difficult, because we are always looking for eager, conscientious peer reviewers. So if they would like to become peer reviewers, so say for my journal, they just write to me. And I think it will be the same for many journals. If they write to the editor-in-chief or one of the editorial board members, then that could be arranged. And if they are if they prove themselves after a number of reviews, they could be invited to join the editorial board. So that is a good way of joining an editorial board. Another way of joining editorial boards is through your own contacts. So they need to know people and work with people who have connections with journals. So that's another way of getting to become associated with an editorial board. And of course, if they publish, after a number of publications, they become known, and they can again join editorial boards of journals. And later on, they can even suggest to a publisher a journal idea, and they can become editor-in-chief of their own journals if they wish. So a summary of my advice there.
Yeah, great. That's wonderful. I think you jumped to the next question, so I'll come back and read that question out for Debra to comment. And that is, for many, the road to becoming an editor begins with becoming a peer reviewer for a journal. Could you discuss your experience of how you became an editor or involved in editorial boards?
Yes, well, I think I became an editor to start, well, an associate editor to start with, through the process of being involved with the journal as a peer reviewer. But it was also a journal where it was launched by a senior colleague of mine at the university. So in some ways, there was also a sense that someone knew me, and therefore I was asked because of that track record. But in some ways, I think it's about how you've proved yourself worthy of the role, almost, by the fact of the commitment that you've made to the peer reviewing process. And that, I mean, some of the comments that we've already been making about what we value in peer review are the same sort of values you want in an editor. So you don't want editors who are just simply trying to make other people write research that fits their own mind frame of what research should be, or wants people to rewrite their papers. You want an editor who has that capacity to see the potential there is in different ways of approaching things. But yeah, I don't think I've got much more to add to that, really. But it's kind of partly serendipity as well as it wasn't strategic. I don't think it'd be fair to say that I took a strategic view of how I would create a pathway from being a peer reviewer to being an editor.
Does anyone else want to share how they ended up with their first editorial position? Philippe, Roberto?
Or in a very simple way, and following exactly what Duke say. I mean, starting as a reviewer, as a young researcher, and then being involved within the community. I think one of the aspects which was not mentioned is also to attend conferences and events, because in our case, the community is quite strong, and for each event we held every year or every 2 years, there is an editorial board which is there and who can meet the participants of the conference. And this is really important for the young researcher and also for the editorial board to get, I would say, ideas about the new subject which are coming up, and also to share about the experience and to recruit new reviewers. We are always looking for reviewers, and it's nice when people are offering themselves to serve as reviewers. And then obviously when you meet the editorial board, those people are saying, okay, it could be nice if you can join and participate and so on. The process is exactly what you was describing. If you are not too bad in the reviewing process, editors are quite happy with the job you are doing, and then you are offered to join and so on. This is, I would say, a kind natural process which is coming up with experience, with years, unfortunately, and I think this is the same process in all disciplines. But the fact to have the possibility to meet the authors regularly in events is something which is quite important. So not only virtual, but really face to face, and to have the possibility to exchange is really important.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add there, Roberto?
I think there are several pathways. So being a conscientious referee is sometimes formalized as a pathway to an editorial role, sometimes is just a check that editors do on you just to make sure that you are conscientious in addition to other qualities. So there are several routes by which you can become an editor. So for example, several journals, especially in certain disciplines, philosophy is one example, are home journals. So they are hosted by a certain department, and that's how you become an associate editor or an editor. So you can see some of the top philosophy journals, you will see that the list of editors is all but diverse. It's like, okay, department such and such, department such and such, department such and such. It's a huge list. So that's one example. A very different example is the way I became an editor of the Review of Social Economy. I don't think this is very common, but I had nothing to do with the society that owns the journal, nor had I ever refereed for them, or had I ever submitted a paper to them. There was an open call for proposals. So sometimes journals do that. It's like, okay, we want new ideas. We want this journal, somebody to breathe new, fresh air in a journal, come with proposals. So being a conscientious referee or being involved in the refereeing process and the editorial process in general is also something important in more subtle ways, as in developing your own ideas about how a journal should be run. So should you see an open call like the one I'm mentioning, you are able to actually draft a proposal based on your own experience. And so apart from these two, is I completely agree with Philippe. What ultimately determines you're becoming an editor is you're being recognized by the scientific community you belong to. And as I said, being a conscientious referee is just a check, because sometimes people are hugely prominent in their own position, but they are, shall we say, unreliable referees, lazy editors and such. So sometimes you trade off these things and say, okay, I really want this person because it sends a signal to the relevant community which I want to target. But at the same time, that's not the kind of person you want to be dealing with papers, because it takes forever, blah, blah, very opinionated on, and so on and so forth.
Great, thank you. Now, we've been filling this session with lots of advice, but I thought that we would just do a quick round robin. If each of you can give me one piece of advice that you would give to an early career researcher regarding publishing.
Victoria?
Yep.
Excuse me to pop in the discussion now, but as you are asking for last advice, I would like to say that we had a technical issue and some users may not have been admitted to the webinar from the beginning. I'm really sorry for that to all the audience and also to the speakers. So in the interest of a fuller reach, if the speakers beside the main advice they are going to share now, if you have time to just say a few words about your journals again, although it's been recorded from the beginning, they would be happy to hear a little bit more about you if it was possible. Sorry for that.
Yeah, not a problem.
Thank you.
Thanks, Charlotte. So Duke, how about you? One piece of advice for early career researchers in terms of starting out in publishing, and then maybe a couple lines about cogent engineering.
Yes. So be prepared for rejections. Your paper may not be accepted immediately. Just make sure that you answer the comments conscientiously, fully, and without having any taking it personally. You need not take any comments personally. Yeah, be prepared to be rejected and persevere. The journal Cogent Engineering is an open access journal. That means it is available to all to read, and authors need to pay. So readers don't need to pay, but authors need to pay to get published. The journal publishes papers in all areas of engineering, all areas. And we don't have page restrictions because the journal is entirely online. And we welcome papers that describe something new, a new contribution to engineering, to science, to knowledge. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So Debra, one piece of advice for early career researchers starting out in publishing, and then a bit about the journal.
I think I'd say get to know the journals in your field. Don't just scattergun submit to journals that seem to have titles that might be appropriate. And I think to get to know the journals in your field, I think it was Roberto who made the point earlier about reputation. You kind of pick it up on the grapevine, talk to colleagues. When you go to conferences, you know, look at what journals people are publishing in. Look at where are people publishing in the area that you tend to be most interested in. So I would say really know the range of journals that exist in your field so that you are submitting somewhere where you stand the best chance of fitting the way that that journal is interested in that research. And my own journal, Research Papers in Education, it's about educational research, focusing very much on professional practice and policy with a broad scope that will allow for the inclusion of a wide range of topics. It's intended to be useful for policymakers. It's very inclusive in accepting things that are interdisciplinary and on the boundaries of educational research, with a key focus on being written in a way which makes it accessible to a broad educational research and policymaker audience.
Great, thanks, Debra. And Philippe, a piece of advice to early career researchers just starting out in publishing.
Yeah, following the advice of Duke and Debra, I would say we'll even go further. I mean, so when you have identified the right journal, try to find a paper which is not so far from the topic you would like to publish. Look at the structure and try to understand how it was organized. I think it's a nice, I would not say a template, but this is a way to proceed and organize a presentation of your results where when you have an added value, you can easily demonstrate. I think this is a very, very, very relevant suggestion. And most of the time it's successful at the end when people are following the organization of the things. About the journal, so LHB, La Revue Blanche Hydroscience Journal, I said we are an old lady, 120 years. And we are focused on hydrosciences, about hydropower, but all the water sciences. We are open access. We are receiving submission in French and in English, and all our archives since 1902 are freely available on the website of Taylor and Francis. So if you would like to look at history of science or history of hydropower, you can look at that, because most of the things that we are using right now have been invented and published in the journal. So I strongly invite historian or people who are interested on history of science to look at it, because they will see evolution of maths, physics, fluid mechanics, and so on within the journal itself as live documents.
Fantastic. Thanks. And Roberto, piece of advice to early career researchers just starting out in publishing and a bit about the journal.
So I'm not going to repeat what other people have said, because I think that the suggestions that Debra, Duke, and Philippe made are absolutely spot on. I would say that the main challenge for an early career researcher is to actually get your first publications out. And this, again, for some disciplines, this is not a major issue because the turnaround time is very short. But in the social sciences, it is a massive problem. So the very first paper I published was submitted in 2001. And to the horror of the scientists among us, I can confirm it was eventually published in print in 2007. So, I mean, this is a problem that most early career researchers will face. So you have to plan ahead. This is absolutely crucial. And for that purpose, I have 3 bullet point suggestions. 1, keep in mind, and I should premise I'm a vegetarian, but you should keep in mind that your dissertation is like a pig. You don't throw anything away. You use every single bit of your dissertation in sensible ways. Remember what Debra and I think Philippe also mentioned about slightly changing the title and then submitting the same article. You should never do that because it destroys your reputation. But other than that, if you have an introductory chapter which is a review of the literature, just send it as a survey. If you have a chapter which has a theoretical part and an empirical part, perhaps there is a theoretical paper and an empirical paper. It's not always the case, but I think one paper, one idea is always a good thing to keep in mind. Which leads me to the next point. choose your journals wisely, in the sense that if you target the wrong journal, you may end up wasting an enormous amount of time. If you're lucky, the paper is desk rejected, but if not, and the paper passes through the first hurdle, the risk is that if it is not a good fit, they will realize very, very late. Finally, build up as soon as you can a stock of papers that you replenish with a flow of new submissions. So you should always have at least 5, 6 papers, at least in the social sciences. Maybe in the sciences it's more or less, but in the social sciences I would suggest always having 4 or 5 papers that are out there, because eventually one will get published and then the new publication comes in to replenish the stock. Oh, and the Review of Social Economy, which I edit, is an interdisciplinary journal that cares about all issues relevant to the social economy. We welcome publications or submissions in sociology, political philosophy, and economics. And we have no methodological, ideological, or other particular bias. We are very open-minded and encourage all of you to submit.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone, for a fantastic discussion. I think we'll open it up to questions from the group now. Victoria, do we have any questions?
Yes. I would like to read one of the questions that we received, and Victoria, please help me to perhaps direct it to the speaker, so you can choose directly who would like to respond, or all of you. So the question goes, papers in international co-authorship are said to have a higher impact. Are they also easier to be published? And if yes, why?
Would anyone like to take that question? Yeah, Debra?
I think the answer is not necessarily. I don't think there's anything intrinsic about a co-authored publication that makes it more likely to get published. But it could be that if what you've got is a very strong research partnership that is spanning different national boundaries, that the significance and the originality of the research that you're doing could be stronger, which could then position it better. But I don't think it's a de facto thing. I don't think simply co-authoring itself makes the article more likely to be published. And certainly reviewers and editors are, well, I would say we're blind to that idea of it's co-authored, therefore we'll publish it. So there's a possibility that co-authorship could increase the quality of the research and make it more publishable. But simply co-authoring, for me, would not be on its own something that would benefit you.
Great. Does anyone have anything to add, Stu?
I think the questioner might have meant such papers are more widely cited. I've heard that, but I've not heard the chances of publishing being higher. You know, there are probably more citations. Yeah, because of the wider readership, maybe.
Great. Next question.
We have a question that is very much related to this one. So perhaps sort of a follow-up question. Is international co-authorship a criteria to access articles?
I'm not sure I understand the question. To access articles, or?
Yes. That was the question.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the meaning is behind that, but I would think the answer would be no, in terms of criteria. But maybe it's for publication.
Yeah, we'll maybe wait for clarification. But in the meanwhile, I would like to ask another question that we received from Sandra, who is asking, I have difficulty with writing off the section papers. How could I adapt historical research to section papers?
Would anyone like to take that one? And
I wasn't
Yeah,
sure
Debra?
what's meant by a section paper. I don't know if that's just me.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure what that term means either. Do you know, Victoria, what that term is? What it refers to?
No, unfortunately, yeah. Well, maybe ask Sandra to clarify if she would like to ask that question or specify what she meant by that. But this is the only thing that we have for the question. But yes, they're also asking a few of the attendees how they can get in touch with you when if they want to send you an email with a question or clarification. Is there maybe we can share then a link to the website or to the journal where you will be able to find the contact details of all our speakers today, so you can then freely send them an email. Let me see if there is a clarification. No, but there is another question from Uriel. Is number of citations more important than number of publications?
From which perspective? You mean for your career, your reputation?
Let's look at that. Let's look at that way. Yes,
Yeah,
please.
It's hugely disciplinary. So in economics, citations don't matter very much. And besides, it's not really the number of publications, it's the quality of publications. So there are the so-called top 5, which are the 5 most reputable journals, and a publication there is very often considered to be lexicographically better than no matter how many publications down the list. So I would say that at least in economics, perhaps in other social sciences in different ways, quality of the publication comes first, then quantity of the publication, and then last citations.
And I would imagine there's a lot of variation depending on different institutions and requirements and kind of the annual assessments and what they're looking at. So it's really probably about understanding what is the norm in your discipline and in the institution you're based at. Are there any other questions?
No, we have not received. I think that all the wonderful answers and the advice was just so well received that people are still digesting. Thank you so much. I will pass on to my colleague Charlotte for some closing words.
Well, on behalf of Euraccess LAC and Euraccess North America, we would like to thank again the speakers and give a warm welcome to Victoria and Taylor and Francis for their collaboration for the series of 5 webinars. We hope that this one was fully recorded, and for those who couldn't access the first part of the webinar, but all of them are available on Euraccess North America and LAC YouTube pages, so do not hesitate to watch them to increase your skills. We also encourage you to sign in our newsletters to be notified when other events of this kind are organizing, and we have a lot in our pipeline for the months to come on EU funding and other interesting and relevant topics. So thanks again, Taylor and Francis. Thanks again, the speakers, and thank you to the audience. Sorry for those who experienced difficulties today, but we hope it will be sorted out very soon. Have a nice afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.